Good morning. I'm going to speak this morning about sulfuritums that are billions of years old, and present to you a talk about the null hypothesis of evolution. That means when evolution does not occur. So let me explain some of those terms so that you can understand what I am talking about. And we're going to try this. So first, what is a sulfuritum? Well, it is a non-photosynthetic, sulfur cycling microbial ecosystem. And it's a very simple ecosystem. It has only a few components. It starts off with sulfate dissolved in seawater, which comes into the ecosystem, and there are called sulfate-reducing bacteria that produce hydrogen sulfide gas. That hydrogen sulfide gas is then cycled through the system, oxidized, we'll try again. Oxidized by nitrate, I'll figure this out. It'll just take a little while.
Window.
Where's the pointer? That's the pointer. Okay. It's oxidized by nitrate, by sulfide oxidizing bacteria that produce sulfur, and then we'll take it back to sulfate. So you see, it's a simple ecosystem that requires sulfate to produce hydrogen sulfide and nitrate to cycle it through the system. I gotta figure that one out. Okay, we will try again.
Stop the lecture.
It's this one here. No, it's this one here. It's supposed to be this one here. Next slide. Okay. So, what is evolution's null hypothesis? Well, what that means is that it's the absence or the nullification of evolution. You cannot understand what the nullification or the absence of evolution is unless you understand what evolution is. You have to understand first what evolution is so that you can understand what evolution is not. And evolution is really a remarkably simple, but of course absolutely important process in the evolution in the history of life. There's only three components to it, and the first is that because all organisms are well adapted to their environment, if they were not, they could not live, The rule of evolution is do not evolve. If it's not broken, don't fix it. That is the explanation why you have in each of your bodies 12 different DNA repair mechanisms that if something goes wrong, it's fixed back to where it was before. You do not want to evolve. But it turns out that the environment changes. And because the physical, biological environment changes, life evolves to survive. And that is what is called Darwinian natural selection. The better adapted to the new environment survive. The ones that are not well adapted are winnowed out. They are removed from the population. And that's all evolution is. It's very straightforward. So, the basis of evolution is that evolution occurs as life adapts to a changing physical, biological environment. Now we get to the null hypothesis. What if that environment does not change? What if the environment is static? That is evolution's null hypothesis. Darwin knew this in 1859. But until 2015, no one had ever found an example of this. And it has to come from the fossil record because you're looking for a lack of evolution over billions, not millions, billions of years. So I want now to switch to philosophy, so that you can understand exactly what this means. This is what is called in logic a syllogism, which is a fancy word which just means if you do not have a cause of some result, you will not have that result. It's very simple. We all learned this back in high school, at least I did. So, for example, if A is a result and only of a result of cause B, and if cause B does not exist, then result A will not occur. For example, if sunlight is the result of the sun, and if the sun does not exist, there will be no sunlight. That's called logic. It is the root of science, and we all know that. And now we get to evolution's null hypothesis. If evolution is a result of a changing physical, biological environment, and if the changing physical, biological environment does not occur, then there should be no evolution. And that is the null hypothesis, the nullification of the evolutionary process. And it must be that way if the statements are true. But what that means is that if you have a stable environment, there should be no evolution if you have a fully adapted ecosystem. It has to be that way, if that is the basis of evolution. So how does evolution work? Well, the environment changes from time to place to place. And as Sewell Wright wrote in 1931 and 1932, he did this graphically by showing a variable, what he called a fitness landscape. So here you have various adaptive peaks that organisms can evolve to adapt. And you have one species in this ecosystem. Well, mutations occur, genetic changes occur. I'm afraid to touch this thing. The genetic changes occur. Organisms come down and get into the adaptive valley, and then a new species will climb a new adaptive peak. And so now you have speciation, you have evolution, you have two species where you only had one before. But that is in a variable landscape. In a static landscape, there is only one adaptive peak. And so the organisms are adapted to that one adaptive peak, and the mutations occur, but they move away from the peak, not toward a peak or not toward a new peak, because there's only one environment. And as Sewell Wright pointed out, he said in a static fitness landscape where there are no changes, then the population can evolve only to that one adaptive peak. And that is what has happened for sulfuritums. Do genetics change? Of course they change. There are always random mutations. There are always lateral gene transfer and so forth. But in a fully adapted ecosystem, in an unchanging environment, there'll be no change in the form, the function, or the metabolic requirements of the organisms that are fully adapted to that ecosystem. And therefore there's no speciation, and without speciation you get no evolution. That is what has happened in sulfuritums. So now I have to show you the examples. So this concept, which you've never ever thought about before, and people have thought about it, they just didn't have any data before 2015. Okay, but now I have to show you that it makes sense in reality, not just in logic. So the first question you have to ask is, why haven't people discovered this? And the answer is, where on earth is there an environment that is essentially unchanging? The land surface will not work. There's erosion and earthquakes and volcanoes and glaciation. It's constantly changing. The atmosphere will not work. Winds, storms, climate change, tornadoes, hurricanes. The ocean waters will not work. They change too. There are currents, tides, breaking waves, and as you know very well here in Concepcion, tsunamis. That's a changing environment. So where on earth is there an unchanging environment? Ocean bottom mud. It's cold. It's quiet. There's no wave action. There's no churning. And before metazoans, invertebrate animals came along, there was no burrowing into it because the animals did not exist. That's for 7/8 of the history of this planet. There's no day-night cycle. It's black. It's dark. There's no light. And there's no oxygen. That is what ocean bottom muds look like. That is an environment that has been on this planet since 4.4 billion years ago. It just sits there. Oh yes, it'll change from place to place where there's a landslide underwater and so forth. But the basic environment stays the same throughout the world as long as you have oceans. So now we go to the geologic evidence. And what is interesting here is I'm going to show you two biotas at 1.8 billion years and another one at 2.3 billion years, and this is half the age of the planet. 1.5 billion years before there are invertebrate animals. This is deep, deep geological time. And what's interesting is that the sulfuritums in these 2 billion year old deposits are just like the sulfuritums that live today for 2 billion years in this unchanging environment. And those sulfuritums were found first by Gallardo and Espinosa. Gallardo and Espinosa, Gallardo and Espinosa, here off the coast of Concepcion. Whoopee! And now they've been found right up all the way up to Central America. So the two really old ones come from Western Australia, as shown here, 1.8 and 2.3 billion years old. And the geology tells you that these are deep water, distal deep water deposits. Well, they were discovered in 2007 by Gallardo and Espinosa off of Concepcion, and since that time have been traced all the way up to Costa Rica, including the Galapagos Islands, right up the coast of the western coast of South America. And these sulfuritums live to 10 to perhaps 20 centimeters into the mud in the ocean. Here they are off of Chile. And because of the Humboldt current, which you will hear about later from Professor Gallardo, they are beneath what's called the oxygen minimum zone, which means they are anaerobic. There's no oxygen where they occur. Now, how do you tell the difference between a sulfuritum and the far, far, far more common deposits that we find throughout the Precambrian that are formed by cyanobacteria, photosynthetic organisms? Remember, the sulfuritums are not photosynthetic. They live where there's no light. But these other ones, these photosynthetic communities, live where there is light. What that means is that the photosynthetic communities spread across surfaces so that the organisms can absorb the light, and there's nothing above them. they need to do that. And so they make flat, laminated communities. But these sulfuridums live in the dark. They don't need light. So they are a cobweb-like assemblage. They have no orientation, and that's the way you tell them apart. Here are some photosynthetic communities, and you can see the microorganisms are flat in layers. And here are the two fossil sulfuridums, and look at the difference. The photosynthetic ones are layered, and these other ones are mottled. And if you look over here on the right-hand side, you can see the organisms are completely randomly distributed. So that's the way you tell them apart. Now, before 2014, none of us who study these fossil communities had ever seen anything like that. It made no sense, and it was given to me to figure out because the other guys couldn't figure. I was in Australia, and they gave it to me, and they said, "Bill, we don't make any sense out of this. We've never seen anything like this." And I got to thinking about it, and knowing the geology, I knew it was deep water, and I know that no one had ever looked at deep water fossil deposits before. It's not a place that we look because we assume there's nobody living there. We were wrong, because Gallardo and Espinosa showed that. All right? So I got in touch with Victor, and I said, you know, I've read your paper. And he sent me some pictures. And it turns out the same doggone organisms live in both these things. It was quite a surprise and quite a discovery. All right, well now I got to show you the data. All right, 2 billion years ago, there was almost no oxygen at all in the world's oceans. Oxygen had not yet built up. It really doesn't build up until about 500 million years ago. So these 2 billion year old assemblages are living where there's no oxygen. Well, I wondered, is there a modern counterpart? So again, I went to the literature and discovered, yes, there are stratified lakes and seas. The Black Sea and Lake Washington are two good examples, but there are about 10 others where the water does not turn over, it's not churned, and consequently there is a layer at the top where there is oxygen, and then there's what's called the chemocline, and beneath that there's no oxygen. Aha, that's the way it was 2 billion years ago. All right. Well, what goes on where there's no oxygen? Where there's no oxygen, ferrous, iron, and titanium are soluble. So they come up into the environment where there is no oxygen. Now, in Lake Washington and in the Black Sea, at that chemocline, there are organisms that are, the modern ones are called metallogenium, that can take the oxygen above and the iron and titanium below and oxidize the minerals, the elements, to make minerals. Hematite, iron oxide, and titanium oxide, which is called anatase. And they get energy from that. And they live at that chemocline. So I wondered, what do those metallogeniums look like? They look like little stars. And they get mineralized and they fall to the bottom of the lake or the ocean. Okay, and then they get preserved. Well, do they exist back there 2 billion years ago? Yeah, they do. They do. They do. Here are the modern ones. The one on the left is just organic material. The one on the right is mineralized. It has encrusting minerals on it. Now, it turns out that 2 billion years ago, yes, there was iron, yes, there was titanium, yes, they came from the deep ocean bottom. They came up into the same environment, and the same little star-like organisms existed, as you can see them above at 2.3 billion and 1.8 billion. But they were described from the fossil record before the modern ones were known, so they have a different name. They're called Eoastrion, which means dawn star. But you can compare them with the modern ones below, and you see it's the same thing. Now, what does that teach us? It teaches us that the waters above these sulfuritums 2 billion years ago did not have oxygen in them, because if they did, these organisms would not be there. They were getting a little bit of the oxygen right at the top of the ocean, and then they fell down into this deposit. Well, that's important because it says, yes, indeed, the 2 billion year old ocean was devoid of oxygen, essentially. And do they mineralize with iron and titanium? Yes, they do. Here, the red stuff, that's hematite. The yellow on the right, that's the mineral anatase, that's titanium. So they live the same way, oxidizing those reduced elements and getting energy. So they had the same metabolism, and their environment was the same. Okay? Well, what about the sulfuritums? Were they anaerobic lived in the absence of oxygen 2 billion years ago? Yes, they did. How do you know that? Well, you look over here on the right, those red filaments are encrusted with pyrite. And you only get pyrite when iron is oxidized to hematite. It comes from the pyrite, the H2S is then made into pyrite in the rock record, in the environment. So that tells you it's anaerobic, and then you do sulfur isotope studies, and they show that these are sulfate-reducing bacteria. But it's not just that. They lived in the same environment, and the same organisms are there. How do you know that? Well, you go to Gallardo and Espinosa. They got the modern ones. You look at that. They have these long, these sort of fat with elongate cells. Now, they do not look like cyanobacteria. I can tell you the cell structure is quite different. But besides that, these are great big things. Victor wrote me and he said they called this one anaconda because it's a great big fat thing, you know, like a big snake. Well, do they exist at 2 billion years? Yes, they do. You see, 2.3 billion, here's the anaconda. Here, 1.8 billion, the same anaconda. Is that it? No, that's not it. There are sulfur oxidizing ones, sort of with intermediate diameter cells. There are more narrow ones that oxidize sulfur, the sulfide, hydrogen sulfide. Yeah, they exist in the 2.3 and 1.8 billion biotas too. See, they're the same. And there's a fourth component. These long, skinny little filaments. They go on long and long and long through the rocks and through the modern ones. And here they are in the 2.3 billion and the 1.8. So you got the same environment, and you got the same organisms, and you got them in an environment that does not change over 2 billion years of Earth history. And the organisms do not change. And their metabolism does not change. Their form, their function does not change. And so I claim that this is the first evidence of a lack of evolution for some 2 billion years. If you stop and think about that, that is a remarkable claim. And you've never heard it before, unless you've read my papers. That's why we write them, folks. But, okay, I call this the Volkswagen syndrome. And I was thinking this is what a philosopher would call an argument by analogy. But here's 1949. Here's 1954. Here's 1966. Here's 1973. Here's 2003. Here's 2013, folks.
13.
Look at that. No evolution. In form, the thing looks the same. In function, it still will drive you to the supermarket. And in energy source, they use gasoline, folks. They don't use hydrogen sulfide, but that didn't change. Oh yeah, there are minor changes inside, just like the genes reshuffle in a sulfuridum. But it doesn't change the form, the function, or the energy source. And they are successful because they are well adapted to this small car market. That's how come they survived for so long. They had very little competition. And you used to have Volkswagens all over the place, throughout the world. Well, we go to our sulfuridums. There's no evolution in form or function or energy source. They live the same place and use the same energy, look the same organisms. There are minor changes, just like there are minor changes inside a Volkswagen. But they don't make any difference to the organisms. There's no new speciation coming up. And they're well adapted to this stable, unchanging environment at the bottom of these muds at the bottom of the ocean. There's no competition there. Nobody else can live there. And besides which, they're entirely asexual, which means they don't have the genetic exchange that we more advanced organisms do. So they couldn't evolve if they wanted to. And the environment did not change, so they didn't change. So it's just like the Volkswagen. The unchanging environment is an ocean bottom mud. It's cold, quiescent, there's no wave action, there's no churning, there's no light, there's no daylight, there's no oxygen. It just sits there with Gallardo's sulfuridums. So, why might this matter? Well, these are the first fossil sulfuridums that have ever been discovered. These are the first fossil deep-sea biotas that had ever been discovered, simply because nobody ever looked there. And this is the first promising evidence of the Null hypothesis to Darwinian evolution. And so for the students, what you should learn from this little discussion is that these new discoveries bring new ideas. and they were spurred by Gallardo and Espinosa. Thank you.